This episode examines the tactical transformations that reshaped the Byzantine army during the 10th century. Our best insights into these changes come from a number of military treatises. Among them, the Praecepta Militaria, attributed to Emperor Nicephorus Phocas around 969, the anonymous Silage Tacticorum from about 930, a short work known as the Syntaxis Armatorum Quadrata, and a text edited in modern times as On Skirmishing, also connected with the reign of Nicephorus. These works shed crucial light on the organization of troops, their battlefield deployment, and the methods by which the Byzantines adapted to new strategic realities. The authors of these treatises provided guidance on marching orders, battle formations, equipment, and battlefield tactics. A key question for historians is how far this theory reflected practical realities during campaigns and whether it shaped the battles fought at Hadath in 954, Tarsus in 965, Doristolon and Alexandretta in 971, the Orontes in 994, and Apamea in 998. In other words, how successfully did Byzantine commanders respond to the evolving military challenges they faced in the East? When describing the infantry, the Praecepta Militaria outlines a distinctive arrangement. Soldiers were to form a hollow square with 3 divisions on each side, amounting to 12 units in total. The structure was left open at regular intervals so that between 12 and 15 horsemen could pass in and out with ease, ensuring fluid cooperation between foot soldiers and cavalry. Each unit was a taxiarchy of about 1,000 men, meaning that the full square comprised a force of considerable size, both stable and flexible. This formation is not unique to the Praecepta. The Siloge Tacticorum also describes a hollow square, this time with 8 to 12 openings. Its author even included precise calculations for the spacing of intervals and the manpower required, producing a more encyclopedic account than a practical one. While the Siloge likely drew on the Syntaxis Armatorum Quadrata, the Praecepta presents a more refined version adapted to the battlefield realities of the mid-10th century. The question arises, was this truly a tactical innovation? And how did it connect with the methods of their adversaries? Square formations were not new in military history. Both the Greeks and Romans had relied on them in hostile territory, especially when fearing encirclement or during emergencies. Yet what is striking is that earlier Byzantine manuals, such as the Strategikon of the early 7th century or the Tactica compiled around 900, do not mention such a hollow square. Its appearance in the 10th century marks a fresh development, one that may have grown out of the experience of campaigning in Mesopotamia under generals like John Kirkwas between 922 and 944. Some scholars suggest that this formation was inspired by the standard layout of Byzantine army camps, which were themselves designed in square or rectangular patterns, divided by main roads and guarded by multiple gates. Nicephorus Phocas himself drew a direct link between the camp and battlefield order. He insisted that soldiers should keep their camp positions exactly as they would in battle, so that a sudden alarm would find them already arranged for combat. He prescribed 8 openings in the camp, aligned like a cross with main roads running east to west and north to south, which mirrored the tactical design of the battlefield square. This continuity between camp and formation made mobilization quicker, safer, and more disciplined. The advantages of the square were obvious. It prevented the enemy from surrounding the army without splitting their forces, gave retreating soldiers a secure refuge where they could regroup, and discouraged desertion by closing off easy escape routes. In hostile territory, where surprise attacks were always possible, the defensive benefits of such a formation were invaluable. Another important development in 10th century tactics concerned the balance between infantry and cavalry. Traditionally, Byzantine armies placed infantry in the center with the general, while cavalry occupied the flanks. The infantry absorbed the brunt of the enemy's assault and launched decisive counterattacks, while cavalry shielded the vulnerable sides of the formation and sought opportunities to outflank the enemy. By the mid-10th century, however, changes in cavalry deployment and its integration with the tactica outlines clear instructions for situations in which cavalry units were forced to retreat. Mounted troops, it advises, should withdraw behind the infantry lines and remain near the wagons, using them as cover. If the pressure became unbearable and encirclement threatened the entire force, the horsemen were expected to dismount and fight as infantry, most likely by reforming into a square or rectangular defensive block. By the mid-10th century, however, Byzantine practice had shifted. Cavalry was positioned inside the infantry square, using the gaps between units to launch attacks. This ensured that cavalry retained the tactical initiative while also enjoying a secure fallback position. If they were repelled, they could retreat into the square to regroup before striking again. Although the idea of cavalry taking refuge behind infantry or near a camp was not new, the Byzantine tacticians of this period gave it a fresh dimension by turning the infantry square into a mobile base for the mounted arm. The cavalry remained the decisive force on the battlefield, delivering the final blow and securing captives and spoils, while the infantry provided both protection and structure. When analyzing the individual components of this system, the Precepta gives particular attention to the taxiarchies that formed the infantry square. The manual describes a formation where heavy infantry stood 2 men deep at the front and rear, while 3 lines of light archers occupied the middle. This gave each unit a depth of 7 soldiers. Such an arrangement represented a significant departure from earlier manuals, which had recommended deeper formations of around 20 lines, with 16 ranks of spearmen and 4 ranks of archers, maintaining a ratio of 4 heavy infantrymen to every 1 archer. The Syllogia Tacticorum offered a compromise, suggesting that infantry depth should not exceed 16 ranks, nor fall below 7. If too deep, missile troops would be obstructed. If too shallow, the unit risked collapse under a combined frontal and flank assault. The treatise considered 10 ranks ideal, with heavy infantry positioned at the front and rear and missile troops in the center. Nicephorus Phocas justified his own departure from the ancient standard by pointing out that the long and heavy phalanxes of Macedonian times were no longer suited to the warfare of his day. Whereas the armies of Alexander the Great had fought with formations 12 to 16 men deep, even the empire's Muslim opponents had by then reduced the depth of their ranks considerably. This practical observation reflects Phocas's realistic approach to contemporary conditions on the eastern frontiers. Another innovation lay in the emphasis on double-faced formations. Both the Sillage and the Precepta applied this term not only to mixed infantry-cavalry armies, but also to the design of each taxiarchy within the infantry square. Heavy infantry were placed at both the front and rear of the unit, with missile troops sandwiched in the middle. Earlier manuals, such as the Strategicon, already mentioned the idea of dividing a deep formation in 2 to face threats from both directions. But the consistent application of this structure in the 10th century indicates its rising importance. In both the Sillage and the Precepta, experienced officers and veteran soldiers were carefully positioned at the front and back ranks, as well as on the flanks. These men were expected to strengthen discipline, bolster morale, and respond effectively to emergencies. It was also in this period that the men of Latoi appeared as a distinct corps. Armed with long, heavy spears designed for thrusting at enemy horses, they were initially organized in small detachments of about 300 men. They were deployed at the intervals between infantry units and, when the enemy came within range, advanced to meet the oncoming charge. By kneeling and fixing their spear butts into the ground, they formed an anti-cavalry barrier intended to break the momentum of heavy horsemen. As their value became evident, their numbers were expanded. Under Phocas, the men of Latoi grew to around 1,200 soldiers, with 100 attached to each taxiarchy. By then, they were no longer kept at the intervals, but held in reserve at the rear of the formation, ready to move forward and reinforce whichever sector came under attack. Later manuals, such as that of Nicephorus Uranus, emphasized their role as a mobile shield against enemy cavalry, advancing through the gaps when needed and taking their place ahead of the infantry line. This evolution of the men of Latoi illustrates how the Byzantines adapted old ideas to new circumstances. They took a simple defensive principle, the spear wall, and developed it into a flexible tactical tool that could be integrated into larger formations. Along with the reorganization of infantry depth and the new role of the cavalry within the square, these changes reveal the dynamism of Byzantine military thought in the 10th century, a period when the empire faced both traditional enemies and new tactical challenges on its eastern frontiers. Once the enemy's intended point of attack was identified, the men of Latoi advanced through the gaps in the infantry formation, usually divided into two groups of 50 under their respective commanders, and deployed directly in front of the main line. This increased the depth of the formation to 8 ranks. Nicephorus Phocas stressed that these heavy spearmen must never fight in isolation, but remain closely integrated with the infantry, revealing that earlier attempts to position them at some distance ahead of the army had proven ineffective. Throughout the 10th century, this unit played an active role in campaigns, reflecting the growing reliance on heavy spearmen in confronting enemy cavalry. A further development in infantry tactics is found in the writings of Nicephorus Uranus at the turn of the century. He described a simple but effective maneuver. 2 files of infantry were merged into one, doubling the depth of the phalanx with minimal disruption to its frontage. This technique, while practical in its application, echoed methods already described by earlier classical authors, who had also noted that increasing depth could be achieved by inserting one rank into another. Similar tactical adjustments can even be traced back to changes in Greek cavalry formations, showing how long-standing traditions were adapted to meet contemporary needs. Phocas also outlined the qualities required of the empire's foot soldiers. Youth, strength, stature, and agility were considered essential, alongside skill with sword and spear. He specifically noted that the best heavy infantry should be drawn from Byzantine and Armenian recruits, preferably men of impressive build and under 40 years of age. Within the infantry square, space could also be made for other groups, such as javelin throwers from among the Russes or other foreign peoples. Earlier manuals had rarely singled out particular nationalities for mention. Yet in the 10th century, Armenians and Russes featured prominently in discussions of troop quality. The prominence of Armenian soldiers in Byzantine armies was not new. From the 6th century onwards, many had entered imperial service, either as voluntary migrants or through forced resettlement from Cilicia and Syria. By the middle of the 10th century, their numbers had grown significantly due to population transfers from reconquered cities such as Melitene, Tarsus, and Antioch. As new frontier provinces were organized in these regions, Armenians came to dominate the military and social fabric of the Eastern themes. They played a decisive role in campaigns across northern Mesopotamia, Cilicia, and Syria, with leaders like Mile and John Curcuas drawing heavily on their contingents. They also took part in expeditions further afield, including the conquest of Crete, where many were later settled as colonists. Their fighting ability and reputation as tough warriors made them highly valued despite the occasional hostility of Byzantine chroniclers. The Russes followed a different path into Byzantine service. Long before the famous Varangian Guard was established under Basil II in 988, contacts had been forged through both conflict and treaty. After the sieges of Constantinople in the 9th and 10th centuries, agreements were reached with Russ's rulers that allowed warriors from their lands to enter Byzantine service. They did not yet form a permanent or separate corps, but fought as individuals or in small groups, often as elite heavy infantry. These warriors, known for fighting shoulder to shoulder in dense formations with large shields, swords, and spears, quickly earned a reputation for discipline and toughness. Later manuals describe them as forming close protection units for the emperor or performing specialist duties on campaign. The employment of these northern soldiers may have reflected the need to counter similar types of infantry used by Islamic powers, particularly the Iranian Dailami, who were renowned for their skill with axes, swords, and spears, and excelled in rough terrain. While the Rus were not numerous enough in this period to form part of the main infantry corps, their inclusion in special units highlights the Byzantine talent for incorporating foreign warriors into its military system. The empire preferred to maintain such contingents along ethnic lines, preserving their cohesion and distinctive fighting style, which added further depth and flexibility to the Byzantine army of the 10th century. One of the most striking passages in the Precepta is the reference to the use of Greek fire on land. The text advises that an army commander should carry small handheld devices, known as cheiromangana, along with 3 elakatia, a swivel tube, and portable pumps designed to project liquid fire. These could be used to gain the advantage when facing an enemy of equal strength by unleashing bursts of the dreaded incendiary substance. The description makes use of 3 significant terms: cheiromangana, chirosiphona, and the phrase manufactured adhesive fire, which all relate to the weapon known as Greek fire. This substance, a volatile and highly flammable compound, was almost certainly produced from crude oil or its distillates, which were readily available in regions such as the Caucasus, northern Mesopotamia, and the northern Black Sea. While incendiary mixtures had been known since antiquity, the true innovation of Greek fire lay not in its ingredients, but in the unique technology used to project it. Recent research suggests that the Byzantine mechanism was based on adaptations of an older Greco-Roman pump. It consisted of 3 main elements: a brazier for heating the oil before battle, a swiveling tube that allowed the jet of fire to be directed in any desired direction, and a bronze pump that provided the pressure to expel the mixture. The handheld versions, called chirosiphones, were essentially portable versions of the siphon, while the term mangana could describe a range of other machines such as catapults, ballistae, or cranes used to launch containers filled with incendiaries. Traditionally, Greek fire was a weapon of naval and siege warfare, but the recommendation that it be carried into pitched battle marks a rare and intriguing innovation. Earlier evidence of smaller, hand-carried siphons appears during the reign of Leo VI, who described how soldiers could employ these devices behind protective shields to spray jets of fire at their opponents. The Silage Tacticorum also refers to machines capable of hurling liquid fire, clearly showing that by the early 10th century, the Byzantines had already moved toward portable versions of the weapon. Whether Nicephorus' focus was introducing something new or adapting ideas from his adversaries is an open question, for Muslim armies had long made use of similar devices. By the early 9th century, Arab forces were employing the zaraka, a bronze piston pump strikingly similar to the Byzantine siphon, which could project burning liquid from a container fed through pipes. More commonly, however, Islamic armies relied on incendiary grenades of clay or glass, larger pots hurled by mangonels, and a wide array of siege engines such as the manjanik and arada. In addition to machines, Muslim armies fielded specialist troops known as nafatun, often drawn from Iranian Daylami warriors who wore protective clothing and hurled grenades or projected naphtha from siphons. Reports describe their use in the opening stages of battle, where arrows and flames were loosed together to break enemy morale. By the mid-9th century, chronicles record clashes between such fire-wielders and Byzantine troops in Mesopotamia, and similar incidents were noted throughout the following centuries. By the 10th century, both sides were making use of incendiary mixtures in field battles, which strongly suggests that the Byzantine adoption of handheld fire projectors for land warfare was influenced by the practices of their Muslim rivals. Whether these devices had any real battlefield impact is difficult to prove. It is likely that their main function was psychological rather than destructive, creating panic and confusion rather than causing heavy casualties. This echoes much older traditions. Sun Tzu had long ago remarked that fire was a weapon used to disorient rather than annihilate, while Roman writers such as Frontinus recorded how carts filled with flammable substances were sent toward enemy lines to terrify them. The psychological effect of Greek fire was legendary, as vividly described during the Crusades. Chroniclers of the Seventh Crusade recounted how the weapon appeared in flight like a great barrel with a blazing tail, roaring like thunder and glowing so brightly that it turned night into day. In this sense, its value lay as much in its terrifying spectacle as in its physical power. Most of the Byzantine cavalry consisted of regular units organized in compact tactical groups of 50 called banda. In battle, they were arranged 2 banda wide and 5 ranks deep, so 100 horsemen formed the frontage. The first 2 ranks were heavily armored lancers, the next 2 were mounted archers, and the rear rank returned to heavy cavalry to give the whole block a front and a rear that could both fight. Making cavalry double-faced was not new. The Strategicon already told commanders to form the second-line divisions so they could meet blows from behind. The depth of these bodies marks a notable change. The Precepta reduces the file from the 8 or even 10 ranks found in earlier manuals to 5, arguing that greater depth did not improve performance. Even the Strategicon admits that older authorities considered 4 ranks sufficient for a cavalry tagma and viewed more as needless. Classical practice bears this out. Spartan cavalry sometimes formed 24 by 4. Athenians used 10 by 10 or 20 by 5 in line with their tribal contingents, and Theban and Boeotian squadrons often formed 10 by 5. The balance between lancers and archers had also shifted by the mid-10th century. The Strategicon wanted roughly 1/3 of each division to be archers on the flanks and the rest lancers in the center. The Silage Tacticorum later describes a 5-rank block where only the middle rank carried bows, a 2-1-2 pattern, and a generation after that, Nicephorus Phocas doubled the archer component to a 2-2-1 pattern, putting full archer banda in the 3rd and 4th ranks, and lancers led by tetrarchs in the rear to preserve the double-faced character. Phocas further insists that the 5-rank depth and the lancer-to-archer ratio must be kept no matter the head count, an instruction that contradicts the Strategicon's more flexible rule to vary depth by unit type. 10th century manuals also record the renewed prominence of the cataphractoi and their triangular assault order known as the trigonos parataxis. Despite the name, the shape resembled a trapezium more than a sharp triangle, which made it simple to form on the field. These were the army's most elite horsemen in training, experience, and equipment. Phocas follows the sillage closely while refining it, building the wedge to 12 ranks with the front rank at 20 troopers and each subsequent rank at 20 troopers rank, expanding by 4 men, 2 per side. So the 12th rank held 64. That produces a block of 504 riders. He also offers a reduced version of 12 ranks, totaling 384 men, beginning with 10 in the first rank and ending with 54 in the 12th. In both versions, the formation is mixed. The first 4 ranks are cataphracts with lances. The 5th through 12th place mounted archers down the middle protected by armor-clad riders around them, and the 2 men on each wing alternate between lancers and archers. Where Phocas departs from the sillage is in relocating the archers into the center so they are screened by the mailed troopers, a change that looks like a response to battlefield realities in the East and may tie to the added use of procursatores, the fast cavalry that shaped the point of contact. The cavalry wedge itself was not a Byzantine invention. Ancient writers credit Scythians and Thracians with developing it, after which Macedonians adopted it because it handled better than a square. Philip II is said to have copied it from Thracian practice he observed early in his reign. The wedge can be seen as half of the Thessalian rhomboid, a formation used since the 7th century before Christ, in which the diagonal leaders controlled maneuver with great agility. Rome's cuneus in infantry tactics shows the same principle in foot combat: narrow in front, broader behind, designed to drive through by concentrating force. Modern scholars have debated whether cavalry can crash head-on into a firm line of heavy infantry. The traditional view is that horses balk at solid spear walls, and that charges work mainly by unnerving defenders and exploiting gaps, after which riders either renew the charge or close for individual fighting. A contrasting view holds that, on open ground, a massed charge can smash through like stampeding cattle. The 10th century tacticians implicitly sided with a staged approach. They arrayed lancers and archers in the wedge to execute 3 phases. First, mounted archers ride in to thin the enemy's front with volleys focused on a single point. Second, the first 4 ranks of lancers. Another important innovation was the adoption of a 3rd cavalry line. The Siloge Tacticorum introduces this reserve and even uses the Arabic term sakah, a telling sign of Arab influence also visible in the works of Nicephorus Uranos and in On Skirmishing. For centuries, the standard had been 2 lines with flank guards, outflankers, and a rear guard, and the Strategicon warns against staking everything on a single line, as some Romans and Persians had done. It points admiringly to Avar and Turkic practice of keeping depth, so that supports can move rapidly to any threatened sector. 2 lines, the Strategicon argues, steady the morale of the front, give a place to rally, and enable reinforcement or cover against flanking. The siloj goes further and places the saka a bow shot behind the second line, matching the first line in numbers and internal structure. If enough cataphracts are available, the center of that third line should also be formed as a triangular assault block. If not, it should mirror the ordinary units. By the middle of the 10th century, the Byzantine army had undergone a series of notable tactical adjustments in the deployment of both infantry and cavalry, largely in response to the strategies used by Arab opponents encountered in the east under commanders such as John Kirkuas, Nicephorus Phocas, John Tsimiskis, and Nicephorus Uranus. Infantry forces advanced in 12 divisions of 1,000 men each, arranged into a double-layered square formation. Each side of the square contained 3 units and carefully measured gaps that allowed cavalry to ride in and out freely while engaging the enemy. Within this structure, the organization of the infantry itself also evolved. The depth of the phalanx was reduced to 8 men, combining heavy and light troops, including the men of Latoi. Soldiers were now arranged in a 2-sided formation, with heavily armed men placed both at the front and the rear of the files, ensuring protection against attacks from behind or attempts at encirclement. The role of cavalry likewise shifted. By this period, horsemen were no longer deployed only on the flanks, but instead operated from inside the infantry square, which functioned as both a camp and a battlefield formation. They launched attacks through the side openings and could retreat back into the square if driven back, making the infantry body a protective base for maneuver. Elite cavalry, particularly the cataphractoi, also adapted their methods. Their triangular wedge formation incorporated more archers, reflecting a clear adjustment to enemy tactics. Perhaps the most striking development of this period was the establishment of a third cavalry line. This reserve force was designed specifically to counter flanking attacks and provided additional depth to the army's overall formation. Byzantine manuals even referred to this third line by the Arabic term saka, underlining the extent to which Byzantine commanders were willing to learn from and incorporate the practices of their adversaries. When examining Leo VI's Tactica, the term phosaton is used to describe the encampment of the entire army, a definition that matches its use in the Praecepta Militaria. This raises an important question. Could the Muslim raiding armies described as playing it safe have been marching in formations modeled directly on their camps? The possibility is strong if we consider Muslim military manuals of the time, which consistently emphasized vigilance and discipline when advancing through enemy territory. Commanders were instructed to scatter scouts and horsemen on all sides when the direction of an attack was uncertain, while keeping the army closely arrayed in its battle order, with the general positioned firmly at the center. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that the Byzantines adapted their tactics specifically to counter the speed, maneuverability, and surprise attacks of Bedouin cavalry. Both the hollow double square, which kept cavalry sheltered inside as a refuge and rallying point, and the double-faced infantry formation, with heavy troops also positioned in the rear ranks, were deliberate measures against Arab enveloping tactics. Yet, as accounts by writers like Sellis and Italiates make clear, the problem of Bedouin hit-and-run strategies continued to trouble Byzantine commanders well into the 11th century. Another perspective points to an even older inspiration: the marching formations of classical tacticians such as Asclepiodotus and Onisander. Onisander, in his General, advised armies to march in compact rectangular formations that were nearly as wide as they were long, making them safe and manageable in emergencies. He stressed that vulnerable elements such as baggage and medical supplies should be kept in the center, with the strongest and most reliable troops guarding the rear. Although he did not speak of regular gaps within the ranks, these could be imagined as the spaces created naturally between different units. Asclepiodotus, meanwhile, described a hollow marching square where the army advanced in 4 divisions, presenting a solid face on every side against potential attacks. Such passages, familiar to any Byzantine officer with a classical education, likely inspired the tacticians of the 10th century to adapt these old marching formations for use in real combat. Modified into hollow squares, these formations could be deployed when advancing through hostile lands, always prepared for sudden attacks from the front, rear, or flanks. In considering the changes made to the infantry taxiarchy during this period, it is worth asking whether the double-faced arrangements described in the Siliga Tacticorum, with its 4-2-4 pattern, and the Precepta Militaria, 2-3-2, were connected to the new positioning of archers inside the formation. Earlier manuals, such as the Strategicon, advised that light troops could be placed either behind the main line or mixed among the heavy infantry, alternating one archer with one spearman. This arrangement was also noted by earlier tacticians like Asclepiodotus, and later repeated by Leo VI in his Tactica. Yet, while this placement of archers might have looked effective on paper, in practice it was problematic. Onisander himself warned that if archers were stationed behind or within the ranks of heavy infantry, they would do more harm to their own side than to the enemy. Shooting over their comrades meant their arrows lost force on the descent and caused little damage. The Silig Tacticorum reached the same conclusion, pointing out that deep phalanxes became useless because slingers and bowmen could not shoot effectively past the solid wall of infantry in front of them. This leads us to consider what role the archers actually played in the Byzantine army of the 10th century, and what the Precepta Militaria reveals about their use. By this time, the standard weapon of the Byzantine archer was the composite bow, introduced into the empire centuries earlier by the Huns. Composite bows had a long pedigree. They had been used in Egypt, Assyria, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the steppes of Central Asia since the 3rd millennium BC. They spread into the Islamic world after the conquest of Persia in the 7th century, with notable variations across regions. Turkish bows, for example, were generally shorter and weaker than Tartar designs. Always made from multiple materials, the composite bow combined wood, sinew, and horn, making it both powerful and compact, ideal for mounted archery. Its maximum range could reach around 225 meters, though its effective range was closer to 90. For comparison, the famed English longbow, often celebrated as a decisive weapon of the Middle Ages, had a similar effective range of around 200 meters. However, modern testing has shown that even powerful longbows could not reliably penetrate quality plate armor at close distances. This suggests that bows of all kinds, whether English or Byzantine, were less about delivering fatal blows to armored men and more about creating disruption, targeting lighter troops, and softening enemy formations before direct clashes. The primary duty of the Byzantine archers was to weaken enemy cavalry before they could strike. By sending volleys of arrows into the advancing horsemen, they aimed to find gaps in their armor, disrupt their ranks, and cause confusion that might break the charge altogether. The effectiveness of this tactic depended largely on 2 factors: the number of volleys that could be released before impact, and the speed of the cavalry charge itself. Unfortunately, the surviving sources do not give us a clear picture of Byzantine archers' rate of fire, organization, or battlefield command. Still, comparisons with other armies can help. Studies of later periods, such as the English at Agincourt and Mamluk forces under Saladin, give us useful insights. An experienced English longbowman could fire roughly 1 arrow every 10 seconds, while a Mamluk ghulam might manage several arrows in just a few seconds. A heavy cavalry charge, such as that of French knights, could cross 250 yards in under a minute, leaving just enough time for 3 or 4 volleys. If we apply these figures to the 10th century Byzantines, whose archers were often drawn from Armenian contingents, it is reasonable to assume they could release 3 volleys at an advancing enemy, perhaps even a 4th when positioned correctly within the formation. Focused decision to move them forward within the taxiarchy reduced the number of infantry blocking their line of sight, extending their effective range and allowing them to strike at closer distance with greater penetrating power. Whether this adjustment was specifically intended to counter the strength of Arab heavy cavalry remains uncertain, but it certainly enhanced the role of archers in Byzantine battle formations. What emerges most clearly from the 10th century manuals is the growing importance of archers as an integral part of the infantry. Their presence within the taxiarchy was no longer peripheral but central, their numbers increasing to account for more than half of each unit's strength. They were no longer a scattered support arm, but fought as one with the heavy infantry, their position reinforced by the rear guard, made up of experienced soldiers who gave stability to the formation. This integration marked a turning point in the tactical role of Byzantine foot soldiers. A useful comparison comes from Western Europe a century and a half later, when Anglo-Norman armies began experimenting with dismounted knights fighting alongside archers. At battles such as Tinchebrai, Bremule, and Lincoln, men-at-arms left their horses behind to fight on foot, supported in some cases by archers placed at the front or flanks to resist enemy charges. At Northallerton, for example, English bowmen unleashed volleys behind a line of spearmen and knights, a tactical arrangement that strongly resembles the Byzantine model of mixing heavy infantry with missile troops. This shift in the West is usually attributed to the strength of royal authority, which could compel mounted warriors to fight as infantry, and the of centralized kingdoms to raise large numbers of foot soldiers. A parallel process was unfolding in Byzantium during the 10th century. The imperial army was transforming the role of its infantry from secondary support into a decisive element of the battlefield. Unlike the strategikon of late antiquity, which treated infantry largely as a defensive reserve, the Precepta placed infantry tactics at the heart of its opening chapters, reflecting their new importance. The balance between cavalry and infantry had also shifted. Whereas earlier armies maintained a ratio of 3 foot soldiers to every cavalryman, by the mid-10th century, the figure was closer to 2 to 1. Foot soldiers were once again the backbone of the army, and their rising significance was confirmed by the appointment of a dedicated commander for the heavy infantry, the opletarches. Scholars of Byzantine warfare often praise Constantine VII, Nicephorus Phocas, and their successors for the sweeping reforms they brought to the army in the 10th century. They restructured recruitment and training, standardized equipment, and imposed a strict culture of discipline and professionalism. The concept of taxis, order and discipline, dominated the military thinking of the time, just as it had in earlier writers like Polybius or Procopius, who always linked disorder in the ranks to failures of leadership. This same belief appears in the reflections of Michael Pacellus, who argued that Basil II considered victory to rest above all on keeping soldiers tightly massed in a coherent body, which in his view made the Byzantine army invincible. One of the most striking innovations of this period was the introduction of the menavlatoi, a corps of infantry armed with heavy spears designed to bring down the horses of charging cataphractoi. These men could be placed ahead of the main line either in a straight row or a wedge formation, fixing their spears into the ground at an angle to receive the attack. Phocas also strengthened the front ranks of the infantry square by deploying a line of seasoned tetrarchs, which effectively increased the depth of the heavy infantry to 4 men, not counting the menavlatoi. If necessary, the formation could be further deepened by doubling the phalanx in the traditional manner described since antiquity. The evolution of this unit clearly reflects a long process of trial and error. Initially, the menavlatoi numbered only about 300 and served mainly as a small protective screen in front of the army. Later, their numbers were quadrupled to 1,200, with detachments placed directly in the first line of each infantry division. At first, they were projected more than 50 meters ahead of the main force, but this arrangement proved ineffective. The reasons are not hard to see. A body of slow-moving heavy infantry, however disciplined, was highly vulnerable once separated from the rest of the army. If the enemy encircled them, as often happened with light and mobile cavalry, their chances of survival diminished rapidly. The episode of the Varangian Guard at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081 illustrates the danger. There, some 2,000 heavily armed men were placed just a little too far forward of the Byzantine line, and when the main army failed to advance in time, the Normans surrounded and destroyed them. Why, then, did Byzantine tacticians of the 10th century feel compelled to create this type of specialist anti-cavalry infantryman? It was not because Muslim armies suddenly introduced heavy cavalry at this time. Such troops had been present for centuries. What had changed was the role of the Byzantine infantry itself. For the first time since the late Roman era, foot soldiers were expected to stand firm, hold a defensive line, and shield the cavalry within their formation against enemy charges. This represented a dramatic shift away from the poorly trained militias of earlier centuries, whose role was usually limited to garrisoning fortresses or waging irregular frontier warfare. Under Phocas and his contemporaries, infantry once again became a disciplined, professional corps, capable of meeting heavily armed cavalry on equal terms. Changes also affected the cavalry itself. Phocas described a standard battalion of 500 horsemen, arranged 100 across and 5 deep, with mounted archers in the middle ranks and lancers at the front and rear to make the unit double-faced. Alongside this, tacticians recommended the addition of a third line of cavalry, known in Greek sources by its Arabic name, Saka. This line was positioned behind the second and served as an extra reserve. Its task was to send detachments through the gaps in the forward ranks to repulse any breakthrough, thereby buying time for the general to keep the rest of the cavalry intact and ready for counterattack. The adoption of the term Saka itself shows how Byzantine tacticians were observing and adapting Muslim practices. In Islamic armies, the Saka was traditionally the rear guard, guarding the baggage train during marches, but the Byzantines reshaped it into an integral element of the battle line. Another adjustment can be seen in the wedge formation of the elite cataphractoi. Earlier manuals placed mounted archers in the middle rows of the wedge, but by the time of Phocas they were moved to the very center, enclosed on all sides by heavily armored lancers. This change likely aimed to secure the most vulnerable part of the formation, the flanks, against sudden attacks. The alteration coincided with the introduction of a new light cavalry corps, the procursatores. These were skirmishers and scouts who rode ahead of the main force, engaging the enemy in preliminary clashes. If pressed too hard, they were instructed to fall back through the gaps in the Byzantine cavalry lines and reform behind them. When the cataphractoi launched their decisive charge, the commander of the procursatores was expected to dispatch detachments to ride along both flanks, protecting the wedge from harassment and keeping the enemy from breaking up its momentum. This adjustment reflects the constant cycle of action and reaction between Byzantines and their Muslim adversaries. The Hamdanids, for example, were quick to notice weak points in the wedge formation and directed their attacks there. In response, Focus not only restructured the placement of archers, but also reinforced the flanks with units of procursatores. This blend of heavily armored shock cavalry, embedded archers, and light flanking troops shows how Byzantine commanders sought to combine flexibility and resilience, turning their formations into tools capable of both absorbing and delivering devastating blows on the battlefield. The aim of this part is to assess the key primary sources that illuminate the Byzantine expansion during the 10th century. My focus will be on examining their social and cultural backgrounds, the context in which they wrote, the sources they drew upon, and the biases that shaped their perspectives. Only by considering these factors can we evaluate their reliability as historians before moving on to a comparative discussion of their value as military commentators. Leo the Deacon's history stands out as one of the most significant works covering the so-called Byzantine reconquest, offering a rare and detailed picture of warfare in this period. Very little is known about Leo's life beyond scattered remarks in his own narrative, a feature he shared with earlier Byzantine historians who sought to model themselves on the classical style of Herodotus and Thucydides. Born around 950 in the small Anatolian town of Kaloe, a bishopric linked to Ephesus, Leo moved to Constantinople as a boy, and by 966 was pursuing a traditional secondary education. His writings reveal his deep grounding in classical literature, particularly Homer, whom he cites repeatedly, but also Herodotus, Arrian, Dio Cassius, Procopius, and other historians whose works were accessible in the imperial library. His language is consciously archaic, often employing classical terminology for military matters, though occasionally he inserts contemporary words for clarification. For example, explaining that the Roman dromones were equivalent to triremes. Like many educated men of his time, his studies centered on grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy, with Homer's Iliad holding particular importance given Leo's interest in the themes of war. By the mid-1970s, Leo had entered the clergy, most likely being ordained as a deacon in 975, and he soon became a member of the palace clergy under Basil II. He was certainly in Constantinople in 985, when he recorded both the downfall of Basil the Nothos and the earthquake that damaged Hagia Sophia, and his description of the naval battle of Abydos that same year suggests a direct familiarity with contemporary events. The earliest possible date for the composition of his history is usually set at 995, when he delivered an oration in praise of Basil II. Some later traditions suggest that he lived into the next century and may even have become Bishop of Caria, though no firm evidence of this survives in his text. Leo's work occupies a middle ground between a universal chronicle and a literary memorial to emperors. Divided into 10 books, it is organized around the reigns of Nicephorus Phocas and John Tzimiskes, while also including sections on Romanus II and the early years of Basil II. Although he originally planned to extend the account into Basil's reign, he seems to have abandoned this, perhaps after deciding to circulate the first 10 books as a complete unit. His narrative is structured around the deeds of emperors, reflecting a broader historiographical trend of the 10th century, in which continuous year-by-year chronicles gave way to accounts centered on the actions of rulers. Dates are provided irregularly, and seasonal references tend to coincide with the rhythms of campaigning in spring and autumn. At the beginning of his history, Leo explains that he relied both on personal observation and on the testimony of eyewitnesses. While he stresses the value of what he saw himself, it is often difficult to determine which events he truly witnessed and which he reconstructed from oral reports. As a youth in Constantinople in 968, he would have been too young to observe events directly, but by 986, he was already attached to Basil II's retinue and able to follow his campaigns. He often signals uncertainty in his narrative, using phrases such as, "It is said," to indicate second-hand information. Unfortunately, he does not name any of his informants or clarify whether he drew on written sources. Later scholars have argued that he probably relied heavily on chroniclers like Simeon Logothetes and Pseudo-Simeon for earlier periods, and that for the years 969 to 971, both he and Skylitzes drew on a now-lost source hostile to the Macedonian dynasty and to Nicephorus Phocas, but favorable to John Tzimiskes. Others have suggested that he may have used material from the Phocas family, from secretaries in the imperial chancery, or even from eyewitnesses who took part in the campaigns against the Rus. Despite his importance, Leo's work is not without limitations. His lack of reference to certain aspects of Phocas's reign, such as the emperor's connection with Athanasius of Lavra, his monastic policies, his controversial legislation, or his dealings with Otto II, suggests significant gaps in his knowledge or deliberate omissions. For this reason, although his history remains an indispensable source for the study of 10th century Byzantine warfare, it must always be read critically and compared with other contemporary testimonies. The details of John Skylitzes' life remain uncertain, but it is clear that he was a high-ranking official in Constantinople during the latter half of the 11th century. He held a series of prestigious titles, including protovestiarios, kuropalates, and proedros, while also serving as prefect of the capital and commander of the Watch. Later chroniclers, such as Zonaras and Cedrenus, referred to him as a Thracian, which suggests that he came from western Anatolia. His family name, Skylitzes, literally meaning little dog, appears to have been rare, with later traces of it found only among clerical figures in the 12th century, who were probably his descendants. His major work, the Synopsis Historian, was almost certainly produced during the early years of Alexius Comnenus's reign. As its title implies, it was conceived as a comprehensive digest of earlier histories, presented in straightforward and accessible language that could be understood by a broad audience. Skylitzes makes it clear that his aim was not to uncover forgotten material, but to reshape existing narratives into a more concise and usable form for posterity. The first version of the synopsis, completed around 1092 to 1094, covered the period from the death of Nicephorus I in 811 to the abdication of Michael Siksik in 1057, and was later used by George Cedrenus. Skylitzes subsequently expanded the account to reach 1079, with this extended version becoming a key source for Zonaras. The work varies greatly in the amount of space given to different emperors, from only a few pages for rulers such as Michael I or Romanus II, to extensive accounts of the reigns of Basil II and Constantine IX. Like Leo the Deacon, Skylitzes organized his narrative around the lives and deeds of emperors, rather than by strict chronology. Natural disasters, unusual phenomena, and omens are all included within the context of imperial reigns, often presented as signs of divine favor or disapproval. For this reason, Skylitzes, like Leo, has been described as a biographer who sought to highlight the military achievements and character of the emperors more than to write a strictly chronological record. The subjects he discusses can be divided broadly into two categories: events in Constantinople, which include ecclesiastical appointments, building projects, and court intrigue, and foreign affairs, particularly wars fought on the empire's borders. His system of dating events, however, is inconsistent and lacks the rigor of earlier chroniclers such as Theophanes Continuatus or George Psychelos, both of whom Skylitzes admired. In his introduction, Skylitzes names 10 historians whose works post-dated Theophanes, though it is unlikely that he consulted all of them directly. We can be certain that he relied on figures such as Leo the Deacon, Nicetas the Paphlagonian, and Manuel the Protospatharios, since these are attested elsewhere. For the 9th and early 10th centuries, his dependence on Joseph Genesios and Theophanes Continuatus is clear, particularly on the Vita Basili in the latter. For the later 10th century, his sources are harder to identify, which has fueled considerable scholarly debate. Some historians argue that both Skylitzes and Leo the Deacon drew upon a now-lost work attributed to Nicephorus the Phrygian, a deacon at the imperial court with detailed knowledge of events leading up to the Russes' campaign of 971, possibly even as an eyewitness. This theory explains certain parallels between the two authors, as well as the ambivalent portrait of Nicephorus Phocas found in their works, which may reflect the blending of pro- and anti-Phocas traditions. Others suggest the use of a war diary for the reign of John Tzimiskes, particularly regarding his Bulgarian campaigns, though whether Skylitzes had direct access to such a record remains uncertain. For Basil II's reign, no original sources survive, but the evidence points to Skylitzes making use of a lost continuation by Theodore of Sebastia, nephew of Theodore of Side, whose own history had extended back to 811. Notably, Skylitzes devotes less attention to Phocas and more to Bardas Skleros, especially in his account of the revolt of 976 to 989, indicating that he may have relied on material that emphasized Skleros's role in military affairs. For the years after Basil's death in 1025, Skylitzes depended heavily on John the Monk, who in turn reworked the earlier writings of Demetrius of Cyzicus. The latter had access to detailed Constantinopolitan annals that preserved valuable information about the empire's wars between 1025 and 1043. Overall, it is clear that the synopsis relies on a fairly narrow set of sources, with Skylitzes often paraphrasing or expanding a single authority, particularly when drawing on Theophanes Continuatus. Yet, scholars such as Flusson and Holmes have argued that this judgment is too severe. In parts of the synopsis, Skylitzes demonstrates a careful and deliberate editorial approach, particularly when working with material, beyond Celis, that has not otherwise survived. Some even suggest that he may have personally gathered information to support and verify what he inherited from his sources. This fits the pledge he makes in his preface. He read earlier histories closely, removed exaggerated or fanciful elements, set aside contradictions, and preserved only what seemed credible. Another valuable perspective on the Byzantine world of the 10th and early 11th centuries comes from Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Antaki. His chronicle provides one of the richest testimonies of the multifaceted connections between Byzantium and Islam, especially under the rule of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. Yahya is unique as the only Greek Christian to compose a surviving Arabic chronicle, which makes his account an essential source for understanding Byzantine Arab encounters in Syria and Mesopotamia during this period. Other Arabic works preserve only fragments or abridged versions of such interactions, making Yahya's text all the more important. He also offers valuable insights into the local life of Eastern Anatolia and Syria, and he stands out for the accuracy and objectivity with which he comments on political and religious tensions across the Eastern Mediterranean. Unlike many Greek contemporaries, such as Leo the Deacon, he avoids indulging in anecdotal tales and remains focused on concrete events. Born around 980 into a Melkite Orthodox Christian family in Fatimid Egypt, Yahya fled his homeland in 1014–15 to escape the religious persecutions of al-Hakim and settled in Byzantine Antioch, where he lived until his death in 1066. He was a well-educated man, possibly a physician, and his chronicle was intended as a continuation of the Nazm al-Jawhar written by his relative, Patriarch Eutychius of Alexandria. Dissatisfied with Eutychius's account, Yahya began drafting his own while still in Egypt, later revising it in Antioch. He produced at least 3 versions, with the final redaction completed after 1034, ensuring it covered events such as the Byzantine conquest of Edessa in 1031. Yahya's chronicle does not follow the conventional analytic style of Islamic historiography, in which events are rigidly listed year by year. Nor does it adhere to the Egyptian tradition of biographical writing. Instead, he organizes his material partly by the reigns of caliphs, first the Abbasids, then the Fatimids, and partly by geography, concentrating on Egypt, Syria, and Byzantium's eastern territories. His perspective remains tightly focused on the Eastern Mediterranean. The sources available to Yahya can be divided into 3 broad groups: Byzantine, Syrian Christian, and Muslim. Up to the reign of Constantine VII, he seems to have drawn upon Byzantine historians such as Theophanes Continuatus and Simeon Logothetes, as suggested by similarities in style and content. It remains uncertain whether he used the original Greek texts or Arabic translations. For the later period, covering the reigns of Romanus II, Nicephorus Phocas, John Tzimiskes, and Basil II, particularly the revolt of Bardas Skleros, he again appears to have relied on Byzantine material, though his version sometimes diverges from theirs. Scholars such as Vasiliev believe he may also have drawn on ecclesiastical records from the patriarchates of Alexandria and Antioch, given his family ties. Beyond this, Yahya made use of leading Arabic historians of the 10th and 11th centuries, including Thabit ibn Sinan, ibn Zulak, Ali ibn Muhammad al-Shimshati, and al-Musabbihi. It is also possible that he was aware of the work of his contemporary Ibn Miskawayh. Abu at-Tayyib Ahmad ibn al-Hussein al-Mutanabbi (915 to 965), often regarded as one of the greatest poets of the Arabic language, was born in Kufa to a modest family and received part of his education in Damascus. His nickname, Mutanabi, meaning the one who aspires to be a prophet, reflects his youthful ambitions, both political and spiritual. During the early 1930s, when he became involved in revolutionary movements and was subsequently imprisoned, he began to compose poetry. His pursuit of patronage and renown eventually led him to the court of Saif al-Dawla in 948, an introduction facilitated by Abul Asahir, the Hamdanid governor of Antioch. Saif al-Dawla proved to be the ideal patron, an influential ruler deeply interested in philosophy and poetry, an Arab of noble lineage at a time when Turks and Daylamites were increasingly dominant in Muslim courts, and a committed defender of Islam. Mutanabi not only admired his patron, but also glorified his military campaigns, particularly those against Byzantium. For nearly a decade, from 948 to 956, Mutanabi accompanied Saif al-Dawla on his expeditions across Syria, Cilicia, and Mesopotamia. These campaigns inspired some of his finest works, written in the Qasida tradition, a highly formalized genre of pre-Islamic origin characterized by strict meter, single rhyme, and extended length, often more than 50 lines. This form was commonly used for madish, panegyric, celebrating the bond between poet, patron, and poem, in which the ruler's reputation was magnified through verse, while the poet secured status and reward. In Mutanabi's work, this relationship is idealized, with Saif al-Dawla depicted as the embodiment of Arab chivalry. While his panegyrics are rich in cultural value, their reliability as historical evidence is questionable, especially when compared with his sharply contrasting portrayals of other patrons, such as the Ikhshidid ruler Abu Kafur, where literary motives clearly shaped ideological narratives. Another figure of the Hamdanid milieu was Abu Firas, 932 to 968, a cousin of Saif al-Dawla, who, despite his Greek maternal background, became one of the most loyal and prominent members of the dynasty. From a young age, he was entrusted with the governorship of Menbij, a critical frontier post on the Taurus, and later Harran, where he gained distinction in conflicts with tribal groups in the Jazira. His devotion to Saif al-Dawla was profound, and he took part in most of the ruler's campaigns until his capture by the Byzantines in 962. Abu Firas spent 4 years as a prisoner in Constantinople, during which he composed a number of poems, later collected under the title Al-Rumiyat. These works provide some of the most valuable contemporary testimony about Hamdanid warfare, containing accounts of campaigns in 950 and 958, reflections on Hamdanid leadership, and even verses recalling his captivity, which included encounters with the future emperor Nicephorus Phocas. Abu Firas' poems stand out because he combined personal experience as a participant with the perspective of someone embedded in the political and cultural circles of Aleppo, likely with access to archival materials as well. A century later, the historian Ibn Zafir, 1171 to 1226, produced a different but equally important contribution. Though removed from the events by 2 centuries, his Book of Histories of Lost Dynasties offers details on Hamdanid campaigns, particularly those of Saif al-Dawla, that are absent from any other source. A learned man and professor at the Al-Kamilia Madrasa in Cairo, before rising to the rank of vizier, Ibn Zafir compiled a wide-ranging account covering the Hamdanid, Tulunid, Ikhshidid, Fatimid, and Abbasid dynasties. His work draws on sources now lost, making it uniquely valuable for reconstructing the dynamics of Byzantine Arab warfare in the 10th century. When considering these figures, Mutanabi the poet, Abu Firas the princely warrior, and Ibn Zafir the scholar, it becomes clear that their contributions differ in scope, method, and reliability. This raises broader questions about the military value of medieval chronicles and literary works. How reliable are the numbers they provide for armies, or their descriptions of formations and strategies? How familiar were these writers with the geography and logistics of campaigns? And to what extent can their accounts be used to reconstruct battlefield maneuvers with accuracy? Modern military historians have long debated the use of such sources. Critics like Verbruggen in the mid-20th century warned against the uncritical acceptance of medieval writers, contrasting the cautious approach of scholars such as Delbruck with earlier traditions that treated narratives at face value. The challenge is to recognize exaggeration, invention, or ideological distortion by comparing multiple accounts, both contemporary and later. In this respect, the diverse social backgrounds of our authors, clerics like Leo the Deacon, officials like Skylitzes, physicians like Yahya, poets like Mutanabi, noblemen like Abu Firas, and scholars like Ibn Zafir, highlight the varying perspectives and limitations inherent in their testimonies. While they are not professional military historians in the modern sense, their works, when examined critically, remain indispensable for reconstructing the conduct of warfare in the Balkans, Syria, and Asia Minor during the height of Byzantine-Arab confrontation. The accounts of medieval chroniclers were often shaped by exaggeration or invention, depending on their loyalties and perspectives. One of the clearest examples is found in the Qasida poetry of Mutanabi, which elevates Saif al-Dawla and his exploits against Byzantium to almost legendary proportions. At other times, religious conviction colored their narratives, with victories attributed to divine intervention rather than human skill. Skylitzes, for instance, describes a storm that suddenly aided the Byzantines at Doristolon as an act of supernatural assistance, while the Muslim writer Usama declared that success in war was granted by God alone, not by planning, numbers, or organization. This emphasis on divine will contrasts sharply with other traditions. Procopius, through the words of Leo Phocas, suggested that wars were more often won through careful planning than through pitched battle. Emperor Leo VI stressed that discipline, leadership, and divine favor mattered more than sheer numbers or courage, while Vegetius had already argued in Roman times that training and skill were usually the decisive factors. For many warriors of the Middle Ages, however, God remained the supreme arbiter of combat, transforming war into something akin to a judicial duel on a grand scale. Religious worldviews deeply shaped the way historians of the period explained causation, weaving the divine into the fabric of their narratives. Another difficulty arises from the language used by chroniclers and the problems this creates for modern interpretation. Translating military terms without sensitivity to their original context can easily distort meaning. Earlier scholars, such as Verbruggen, argued that vernacular sources were often the clearest, since their terminology left little room for ambiguity. He pointed to examples where German military vocabulary entered Romance languages, and argued that these terms were usually distinct and precise, even when chroniclers did not always differentiate between units. Later critics like Abels and Murillo challenged this view, insisting that historians must be cautious not to project modern categories onto medieval terms. They argued that each word must be understood within its own social, administrative, and cultural framework, since terminology reflects the way contemporaries conceptualized warfare rather than how we might classify it today. A good case study of this issue is the Byzantine use of the term cataphract, often associated with the heavily armed cavalry of the 10th century. For many years, scholars believed that this elite unit was revived by Emperor Nicephorus II after a long absence, with his legislation regulating their recruitment, arms, and training. Their apparent disappearance under Basil II was taken as evidence of disbandment. Others have pointed out, however, that the wedge-shaped formation of the cataphractoi may have originated earlier, during the campaigns of John Curtius in the mid-10th century, and that the unit itself had likely never truly vanished. The assumption of a gap in its existence rests largely on the absence of the term in sources between late antiquity and the 10th century. Yet the rediscovery that the treatise On Strategy, once thought to date from the 6th century, was actually compiled in the reign of Theophilus in the 9th century, shows that the term never disappeared entirely. What this debate illustrates is that chroniclers often employed archaic or classicizing vocabulary, not necessarily to reflect reality, but to display erudition. As a result, one cannot simply equate their words with contemporary military practice. For example, Orderic Vitalis used the term pedits to mean both common infantry and dismounted knights, while Leo the Deacon regularly referred to iron-clad horsemen in ways that are inconsistent and highly stylized. It is clear that these choices were shaped as much by rhetorical tradition as by military accuracy. Coelius has argued persuasively that the reappearance of cataphractos in texts of the early 10th century was incidental, since other terms, such as kabularios or klibanoforos, were equally available and commonly used in military manuals like Leo VI's Tactica or On Skirmishing. The fact that authors preferred one word over another may say more about their literary tastes than about actual developments on the battlefield. Thus, rather than assuming the disappearance or reintroduction of units, historians must carefully weigh the evidence, recognizing that medieval terminology often distorts rather than clarifies. The same caution applies to the reliability of chroniclers as observers of military events. Many had little direct experience of warfare, which made their accounts vulnerable to inaccuracies. An instructive comparison comes from the final battle against the Rus at Doristolon in 971. Skylitzes, who had military experience, recorded the details of Emperor Tzimiskes' feigned retreat with precision, while Leo the Deacon reduced the maneuver to a simple statement that the Byzantine troops fled. Such disparities remind us that clerical or literary authors should not be dismissed as uninterested in military matters, but neither should their accounts be treated uncritically. Their descriptions reflect the priorities and cultural assumptions of their time rather than the expectations of modern military analysis. This leads to a final issue: the use of numbers in medieval sources. Estimates of army sizes or troop compositions are often inflated or deflated, depending on the author's sympathies. Victories could be magnified by exaggerating enemy strength, while defeats might be excused by underreporting one's own forces. Even when chroniclers had potential access to records, whether through state archives, ecclesiastical contacts, or family connections, there is little guarantee that they used such information accurately or objectively. Some Byzantine and Abbasid governments maintained detailed registers of soldiers, but whether chroniclers could consult them remains doubtful. Those who did, like officials working close to the court, might present statistics selectively, shaped by the political or rhetorical needs of their narratives. The implication for modern historians is clear. Medieval chronicles are indispensable sources, but their testimony must always be examined critically. Their figures, terminology, and attributions of causation reveal as much about the mindset and cultural framework of their authors as they do about the events themselves. Recognizing these limitations is essential if we are to use them responsibly in reconstructing the military history of the 10th century. As I turn to the Byzantine material, my first concern is how often and how reliably the chroniclers give numbers. Both Leo the Deacon and Skylitzes supply far more figures after the 900s and 50s, and they do so mainly for campaigns in the Balkans rather than in Syria. In Leo's first 9 books, which cover the reigns of Nicephorus Phocas and John Tzimiskes, he offers 10 separate troop estimates. Only 2 appear in the opening books on Romanos II and the Cretan expedition of 960/61, and both look inflated. He claims that a night sortie early in the siege of Chandax surprised 40,000 defenders, purportedly only part of the garrison, and later assigns the impossible total of 400,000 to Phocas' force against Tarsus in 965. Skylitzes is likewise thin on dependable figures before his chapter 14 on Phocas. He repeats that Tzimiskes slaughtered 5,000 Muslim horsemen near Adana in 964 and ascribes 100,000 men to the Fatimid relief army for Antioch in 970, a total that invites doubt. Once both authors reach the Balkan campaigns, their numbers become fuller and usually tighter. In books 6 through 8, Leo gives 8 further estimates for Byzantine and opposing forces, such as 30,000 Scythians and 10,000 Byzantines at Arcadiopolis in 970, and he even attempts casualty counts, recording 20,000 enemy dead against only 55 Byzantines. The latter disparity has rightly raised eyebrows. Even if Leo had access to official returns, the Rus losses read like heroic inflation to magnify Tzimiskes' triumph. More persuasive are his order of battle figures for the fighting outside Preslav in 971, where he speaks of roughly 15,000 heavy infantry and 13,000 cavalry, including the Immortals. Plausible numbers for the scale of that expedition. Skylitzes, by contrast, floods chapter 15 with a dozen estimates for Arcadiopolis and Doristolon. He assigns an extravagant 308,000 to the combined Rus, Patzinak, and Magyar host, an obvious boost to the glory of the Byzantine victory, while setting the imperial field force at a more credible 12,000, though his claim of only 25 casualties strains belief. For Doristolon, he gives several useful pieces. The emperor's vanguard of 5,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, 8,500 Bulgars drilling outside Preslav, 8,000 in the citadel garrison, 330,000 for Sviatoslav's army, and 20,000 Bulgars captured after Preslav fell. Except for the enormous totals for Sviatoslav's host, and perhaps the number of Bulgar captives, the rest look reasonably grounded, not least because they avoid the tempting round tens of thousands. Still, even where both writers seem to draw on a common dossier for the Bulgarian campaign, their numbers rarely align. Arabic writers are understandably better informed about the 950s to 960s fighting in Cilicia and Syria. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Antaki and Ibn Zafir, in particular, each provide 9 separate figures for troop strengths and casualties between 938 and 964, and their data are crucial for reconstructing the run of campaigns across those decades. Ibn Zafir's narrative is especially valuable, preserving details not found elsewhere. For Saif al-Dawlah's 938 push toward Anzitin and Hisn Ziyad, Ibn Zafir claims that John Kerkuas marched out to meet him with 200,000 men, clearly an exaggeration, while also noting a 20,000-strong body of Byzantine patricians, almost certainly a tagmatic composite from the capital, 70 of whom were captured when Saif's Ghulams struck their formation. Given that individual tagmata hovered around 4,000 men, the 20,000 figure for a combined elite contingent is not inherently implausible. Abu Firas also quotes Kerkuas's army at 80,000, which is still high for a pre-955 field force and likely reflects a tradition of amplifying Byzantine numbers to enhance Arab success. A later estimate of 40,000 Byzantines sent against Saif in the summer of 951, no battle ensued, but the Arab raids on Samandos and Charsianon were judged successful, sits more comfortably. For the 2 decisive defeats at Marish, 953, and Hadath, 954, Ibn Zafir again provides the key numbers. At Marish, he speaks of an elite strike group of 600 cavalry routing Phocas's much larger force, a clear flourish to dramatize Saif's victory and explain the high-profile captures of Constantine Phocas and, as Abu Firas adds, Leo Malinos. For Hadath, he has Bardas Phocas mustering 50,000 infantry and cavalry, reinforced by foreign contingents like Russes, Bulgars, and Armenians, and losing about 3,000 men, while Saif personally led 500 Ghulams in a thrust at the enemy center. These totals are sensible for a clash over such a strategic frontier fortress. Yahya supplies 4 figures for Tzimiskes operations around Amida, Arzen, and Mayafarikin in June 958, and the defeat of Saif's lieutenant Nadja al-Kasaki, who is said to have brought 10,000 men and to have lost half of them, with 3,000 taken prisoner. A second victory later that autumn at Raban produced 1,700 captives, though the overall numbers engaged are not given. Abu Firas adds that the eunuch Basil the Parakoimomenos brought 12,000 reinforcements from Constantinople to bolster Tzimiskes after his initial success. Yahya further reports 30,000 troops mustered by Saif for his famous November 960 expedition, which ended in ambush near Marash by Leo Phocas and Constantine Malenos. The Byzantine strength is not stated. 2 years later, during the imperial drive that seized Anazarbus and brought on a battle with forces out of Tarsus, Yahya tallies 5,000 Muslim dead and 4,000 prisoners, and he also records the massacre of the Tarsian cavalry by Tzimiskes near Adana in 964, estimating 4,000 killed. Skylitzes knows the same episode and puts the fallen at roughly 5,000. Taken together, these patterns are clear. Byzantine chroniclers are most numerical and somewhat more reliable when dealing with Balkan campaigns after the 900s and 50s, while Arabic authors provide the most granular counts for the eastern fronts. Inflated totals appear on both sides, typically to magnify victories or dramatize defeats. But where figures avoid conspicuously round magnitudes and are tied to specific units or battlefield functions, they tend to be the most persuasive. A further issue concerns the geographical knowledge of the chroniclers and how well they understood the regions where the campaigns took place. One must ask whether they provide enough detail to follow the route of armies, or whether they describe in any meaningful way the fortifications of key cities, the surrounding countryside, or the battlefields themselves. When examining the Byzantine writers, it is clear that both Leo the Deacon and Skylitzes depended heavily on second-hand reports rather than first-hand familiarity with these areas. Their place names, descriptions of rivers and plains, and even their comments on major cities such as Chandax, Tarsus, and Preslav are generally drawn from eyewitness testimony provided to them rather than their own observation. Leo the Deacon offers one of his best geographical passages in his account of the siege of Chandax, where he not only notes the imposing defenses of the city, but also emphasizes the importance of reconnaissance before launching a siege. His narrative highlights both the position of the walls and their strength, describing how one side of the city was protected by the sea, and the other by a flat, rocky plateau on which the fortifications stood. The walls themselves were broad enough for wagons to pass each other along the ramparts, and outside them ran 2 deep and wide moats. He also provides some valuable details about Tarsus, which he describes as having towering double walls and a broad moat, with the river Kidnos cutting through the city and crossed by 3 bridges, while the surrounding plain was especially favorable for cavalry operations. Beyond these examples, however, Leo's geographical detail is inconsistent. His description of campaigns in Syria during the 960s is sketchy, often little more than a statement of departure and arrival points, such as the vague note that Phocas marched from Cappadocia toward Tarsus, or that the emperor moved swiftly to Antioch to begin a siege. The same weakness appears in his coverage of Archidiopolis in 970, where he omits even the name of the battlefield and reduces his description to ambiguous remarks about the enemy camp being not far from the Byzantines and the ambushers lying in nearby thickets. He is somewhat better informed when narrating Tzimiskes' campaign in Bulgaria in 971, where he at least refers to the crossing of the Danube, the army's stop at Adrianople, the narrow mountain passes leading into Bulgaria, and the plain around Preslav that was suited for cavalry. Yet even here, his detail fades once the focus shifts to Doristolon, where he names the site but offers no real sense of the terrain on which the decisive battle unfolded. Skylitzes is even weaker in geographical awareness. His coverage of Kirkuas's operations in Mesopotamia and Cilicia in the early 10th century compresses events into a generalized narrative of conquests, with virtually no information about terrain or specific routes. His account of the Magyar invasion of the Balkans in 934 is equally vague, describing only that the invaders overran the west up to the city. He does slightly better when recounting Phocas's Cilician campaign of 964, where he names several cities taken or destroyed, Anazarbos, Rossos, and Adana, and notes that the emperor paused at the fortress of Drizion in Cappadocia before advancing. Even so, the details remain minimal, and his version of the fall of Mopsuestia contradicts Leo's. Where Skylitzes attributes the surrender to famine, Leo insists the walls were breached by fire. On the Balkan front, Skylitzes' deficiencies are even more pronounced. His narrative of Arcadiopolis contains no topographical detail beyond noting that Bardas Skleros set ambushes in suitable places. For Doristolon, he lists a few important locations, such as Raidastos, where Tzimiskes encountered a Bulgar embassy, and Preslav, which he calls the seat of the Bulgar kings. but he says little about the actual terrain or fortifications other than remarking that the citadel was very well fortified and impregnable. Thus, while both chroniclers provide occasional nuggets of useful geographical description, their accounts as a whole lack the detail that would allow a modern reader to reconstruct routes, understand fortifications, or visualize the battlefields with any precision. The synopsis again proves disappointing in its treatment of the siege of Dorestolon and the subsequent clashes outside the city between Byzantine forces and the army of Sviatoslav. From Skylitz's account, we can at least infer that there was a plain in front of the city's main gate, where the emperor assembled his troops. He also notes that Dorestolon lacked a moat, since Sviatoslav is said to have dug a defensive trench during the night to prevent the Byzantines from moving siege engines into place. The fact that Skylitzes knew the name of the estate, where Admirals Leo and Nicephorus stayed during the siege, despite mentioning very few local place names elsewhere in this section, shows how dependent he was on oral testimony. Overall, while his account of Tzimiski's Balkan campaign is one of the most detailed we possess, it still provides little consistent information on the topography of the battlefields, even though the lay of the land was crucial to the outcome of the fighting. By contrast, the Arab sources offer much richer detail about geography and routes, enabling us to trace with far greater confidence the paths of armies during the annual campaigns across the Taurus in the mid-10th century. Their accounts preserve names of rivers, towns, fortresses, and mountain passes, and two of them, Mutanabi and Abu Firas, wrote as direct eyewitnesses to Saif ad-Dawlah's expeditions up to 956. Their testimony is reinforced by Yahya, who drew on a range of Greek, Syrian, and Muslim traditions, and by Ibn Zafir, who preserved valuable additional material. Mutanabi, in particular, accompanied Saif on every campaign between 948 and 956, composing a celebratory poem for each and glorifying the emir's exploits. 3 expeditions stand out for the geographical information they yield. The first is the campaign of 950, when Mutanabi describes the invasion of Cappadocia and Charcianon. Saif's forces entered Byzantine territory through Al-Safsaf and Hizn al-Uyun, then advanced to Samandu, Zamandos, south of Caesarea in Cappadocia. Marching northward towards Charcianon, they crossed the Halys River and clashed with Bardas Phokas in the valley of the Lycos. On the return journey, however, Leo Phokas ambushed them in a narrow pass that Yahya alone identifies as the Darb al-Kankarun. A second major expedition 3 years later took Saif's troops through Haran, Duluk, Lake Sanga, and the defile of Al-Kula before they ravaged the countryside between Melitene and Arka. Mutanabi records that on the way back, the army found the pass of Mausar blocked, forcing them to divert through Melitene and along the Euphrates, passing Al-Minsar and Hisn al-Ran before reaching Samosata. When news arrived of Byzantine incursions into northern Syria, Saif turned south along the Euphrates to Duluk and surprised the enemy near Marash, inflicting a decisive defeat at Gaihan. The most detailed account is of the 956 expedition. Here, Mutanabi describes the army crossing from Haran through Hisn ar-Ran and Hisn al-Hama into Anzitin, where John Tzimiskes, then strategos of Mesopotamia, sought to block them. Saif devastated the countryside around Tel Bitrik and Arsenas, then on his return faced a Byzantine force at the defile of Darb Bakasaya, near the Argana Su River, where he defeated Tzimiskes in battle. These poems are invaluable for modern historians seeking to plot the routes of Hamdanid expeditions, since they preserve names of places otherwise lost. Scholars have identified locations such as Darb al-Kula and Darb al-Mawzar south of Melitene, Hisn al-Ran by the Euphrates, and Sumnin near a small lake southwest of Harput. Yet Mutanabi's topographical detail is uneven. While he notes rivers, valleys, and passes, he rarely describes the nature of the battlefields in practical terms, whether they were flat, rocky, or suitable for cavalry. Such information would be precious for reconstructing tactics, but it was not the purpose of poets or chroniclers of the time, who sought to celebrate victories rather than document terrain. Compared with Mutanabi, Yahya is less detailed in tracing routes but does record the main strategic objectives and besieged cities. He tells us, for example, that Saif besieged Barzuya in 948, while Leo Phocas was at Hadath, and that Theodosiopolis was the target of the following year. He also names Charsianon and Hadath in connection with the 950 expedition, though without listing all the smaller fortresses captured along the way. For the key campaigns of 953 and 954, Yahya confines himself to noting the passes of the Merwan and Samosata and the fortress of Hadath. Thus, while his account lacks the vivid detail of Mutanabi's poetry, it still highlights the chief centers of strategic importance in the struggle between Byzantines and Arabs. Yahya's account becomes more precise when describing the campaign of 956, where he identifies Saif ad-Dawlah's main objectives as Batan Hinzit and the river Arsanas, where the emir encamped, and Tel Bitrik, where Tzimiskes positioned his own troops. He also notes the defile of Tailurs, or Darb Bakasaya, as the site of the decisive clash between the two sides. Elsewhere in his work, Yahya offers scattered but valuable geographical details that help confirm the reports of Mutanabi and Abu Firas. Among these are rare references, such as the fortress of Al-Yamani besieged by Tzimiskes in the summer of 958. Overall, however, his knowledge of the landscapes and operational theaters of the wars is relatively limited compared with the poets. Leo the Deacon, by contrast, devotes much of his history to the exploits of the Phocas family, offering detailed accounts of the victories of Nicephorus Phocas and his brother Leo in Asia Minor, Crete, and the Balkans. This makes his work one of the most important sources for understanding the Byzantine military expansion of the 10th century. When describing the Cretan expedition of 960, he records that the emperor drew up his army in 3 divisions, bristling with shields and spears, and launched a frontal assault on the defenders. Beyond this mention of a tripartite formation and direct attack, likely by elite heavy infantry operating from the beachhead near the city walls, little information survives about the course of the battle, the maneuvers involved, or the officers in command, though he does note the presence of Pastilas, strategos of the Thracian theme. In the following year's campaign, Leo describes the Byzantine formation as deep and oblong, but provides no additional details on troop numbers, ranks, or the types of soldiers deployed. When recounting the crucial battle outside Tarsus in 965, he again offers few specifics on maneuvers, but emphasizes the discipline and precision with which the Byzantine forces advanced. Evidence, he suggests, of the rigorous training introduced under Phocas. He does describe the battle order: ironclad cavalry in the front ranks, followed by archers and slingers, with the emperor commanding the right wing of the cavalry and Tzimiskes leading the left. For the Bulgarian campaigns of Tzimiskes, Leo notes that at Preslav, the Byzantine army was arranged in a deep phalanx. The sight of this disciplined force, he says, terrified the enemy, whom he labels Tauroscythians. He explains that the Bulgars had formed a dense infantry line to withstand the assault, but that the outcome was decided when the Immortals, the elite cavalry unit, charged against their left wing at the emperor's order. The siege of Dorystalon receives the most elaborate treatment in Leo's work, clearly influenced by the style of ancient historians. He enlivens his narrative with character sketches and portrays Tzimiskes as both strategist and warrior. He identifies 5 separate engagements fought outside the city, describing them in varying levels of detail. Yet, despite his desire to dramatize the events, his tactical explanations remain brief, and he often shifts focus to heroic duels modeled on Homeric tradition. Thus, after noting that both sides fought fiercely in one clash, he quickly turns to individual feats of Svendoslavos and Theodore Lalakon, later highlighting the combat between Animus and Ikmor. Even so, Leo provides 2 important descriptions of Byzantine battle formations. Before the first clash outside Dorystalon, he explains that the emperor placed heavily armored cavalry on the wings, infantry in front, and archers and slingers behind, with orders to maintain steady fire. Before the final battle, he records that Bardas Skleros led a flanking maneuver that encircled the enemy, a tactic echoing contemporary military manuals. Skylitzes, on the other hand, omits many of the details that Leo preserves. His synopsis gives only the bare essentials of major battles, often without mentioning commanders, unit names, or tactical arrangements. For example, when describing the disastrous Byzantine defeat at Achelous in 917, he merely observes that the Bulgars were routed and slaughtered, omitting the well-known anecdote of the panic caused by a runaway horse in the Byzantine ranks. His account of Leo Phocas' ambush of Saif ad-Dawla in the Taurus passes in 960 is similarly brief. Chamdan advanced into the narrow defile of Adrasos and was suddenly attacked by troops rolling down boulders and hurling missiles from hidden positions. For the Syrian campaigns of the 9-6-10s, Skylitzes provides no tactical detail at all, even for the expeditions near Amida in 964, on the plain of Tarsus in 965, and at Antioch in 968. His narrative becomes far more useful, however, in the description of Tzimiskes' Balkan operations of 970 to 971. Here, his account rivals Leo's in depth and may have drawn from the same eyewitness reports or official records. For the ambush of the Patzinaks at Arkediopolis, Skylitzes recounts how a unit commanded by Alacasius lured the enemy with a feigned retreat before Byzantine forces struck from the flanks and encircled their opponents. Yet even in this well-informed passage, his focus remains on the sequence of the engagement rather than its strategic background. When dealing with Preslav, Skylitzes reduces the entire episode to a few lines. The Byzantines surprised 8,500 Bulgars, who resisted briefly before breaking and fleeing, with many killed and others retreating to the citadel. He provides no detail of formations or tactics, though the specific figure of 8,500 suggests that he had access to some reliable record of the event. The synopsis recounts 5 separate encounters between the Byzantine forces and the Rus during the siege of Dorystalon, even including the well-known duels such as that between Theodore of Mystia and Ikmor, which are also found in Leo the Deacon's work. Yet Skylitzes' description of the actual fighting is underwhelming. He gives no breakdown of the armies, no mention of unit structure, numbers, or commanding officers, and provides only the most basic outline of battlefield movements. The one exception comes in his account of the first clash, where he notes that the battle was evenly balanced for much of the day until evening approached, and the Byzantines rallied, charged the Russ' left wing, and inflicted heavy losses through the sheer force of this maneuver. This rare insight, almost certainly describing a charge of heavy cavalry, makes his account particularly valuable despite its overall brevity. Although Skylitzes and Leo agree on the main points of the battle, the synopsis lacks the depth of personality and psychological detail found in Leo's history. Leo often sought to portray the emotions of ordinary soldiers, the fear that gripped them, and the mindset of commanders, adding vividness to his descriptions through his own patriotic perspective. Skylitzes, in contrast, tended to highlight the individual feats of leading figures while offering little detail on strategy, geography, or logistics. The difference in their approaches, combined with the different times in which they were written, ensures that both accounts remain indispensable to modern historians seeking to understand warfare in the 10th century. Muslim chroniclers, for their part, provide far more precise geographical information, naming rivers, fortresses, towns, and routes, but they are rarely interested in narrating the flow of battles. With the exception of the clash at Hadath in 954, where some details survive, their works generally omit information about troop deployments or maneuvers. Mutanabi does note with surprise the diversity of the Byzantine army, commenting that only interpreters could understand the many languages spoken among its ranks, and he also records the presence of the cataphractoi cavalry, marking the first time this unit is mentioned in a 10th century source. Mutanabi, Abu Firas, and Ibn Zafir all highlight Saif al-Dawlah's decisive charge with 500 elite Ghulam horsemen, a maneuver apparently aimed at the center of the Byzantine line where Focus Banner was visible. Yahya adds that the fighting lasted until the time of the afternoon prayer, suggesting the intensity. It is therefore not surprising that Byzantine writers concentrated more on campaigns in the Balkans, while Muslim sources were far better informed about events in Cilicia and Syria. Leo the Deacon and Skylitzes offer numerous estimates of troop numbers in their accounts of Focus and Simiska's Balkan expeditions, many of which seem reasonable. Yet, when they mention figures for campaigns in the East, these are typically exaggerated and unreliable. Conversely, although Mutanabi and Abu Firas were eyewitnesses to campaigns in the East, they rarely provide figures for Hamdanid armies, and when they do, the numbers are inflated, likely intended to magnify Arab victories over their Byzantine enemies. For more balanced data, historians must rely on comparing the works of Yahya of Antioch with those of Ibn Zafir. Mutanabi's poetry contains occasional, unique geographical observations not found in any other contemporary source, but like other Muslim accounts, his descriptions lack the detail necessary to reconstruct the nature of battlefields. While he and others sometimes identify the general setting of a conflict, they never describe whether the terrain was flat, rocky, marshy, or suitable for cavalry, factors crucial to understanding outcomes. Byzantine authors are similarly limited, offering only vague descriptions of cities and battlegrounds, with just a few exceptions where more detail survives. Ultimately, when describing major clashes of the period, Byzantine chroniclers concentrated almost entirely on the Balkan theater, paying particular attention to Preslav and Dorostalon in 970 to 971. Except for the sieges of Chandax and Tarsus, they rarely provide clear accounts of fighting in the East. And even in their most detailed narratives, They tend to omit unit names, tactical details, and the exact flow of the battle, preferring instead to highlight the deeds of individual leaders. Muslim accounts, though geographically richer, are even more limited in terms of military detail, showing little interest in the tactics or outcomes of the battles themselves. This section turns to the question of tactical developments within the Byzantine imperial army during the 10th century, using the great battles of the era as case studies. To uncover these changes, the most useful material comes from the surviving military manuals of the time, which outline in detail how armies were supposed to be organized, deployed, and maneuvered in the field. Earlier discussions have examined their recommendations on marching formations, battle order, weapons, and unit tactics, as well as whether these instructions reflected genuine innovation or simple adaptation to the strategic needs of the eastern frontier. To see how theory played out in practice, it is necessary to look at a series of major battles. Hadath in 954, Tarsus in 965, Arcadiopolis in 970, Doristolon in 971, Alexandretta in the same year, the Orontes in 994, and Apamea in 998. By examining these encounters, one can begin to judge how effectively the Byzantines adapted to shifting threats from their eastern enemies, how often their responses went beyond the guidance of the manuals, and what this tells us about the role of literacy, officer training, and professionalism in the Byzantine command system. The evidence also sheds light on discipline, morale, and the esprit de corps of the predominantly Eastern armies that took part in these campaigns. The Battle of Hadath on the 30th of October 954 stands out as one of the most dramatic defeats of the century. Bardas Phocas, commander of the imperial forces, faced Saif al-Dawla near the town of al-Hadath with an army said to number 50,000. Muslim sources describe this army as strikingly multi-ethnic. Mutanabi expressed astonishment at the array of different peoples, claiming that only interpreters could bridge the language barrier. He noted the presence of Byzantines and Rus, while Abu Firas added Armenians and Slavs, and Ibn Zafir spoke of Rus, Bulgars, and Armenian infantry and cavalry. The consistent emphasis on Armenian and Rus contingents across several accounts suggests that these forces were present in significant numbers, enough to be observed independently by multiple witnesses. This observation aligns with the comments found in the military handbooks, which stressed the qualities desirable in different nationalities for imperial service. While the presence of such groups does not necessarily signal a tactical transformation in response to Eastern foes, it does highlight the broad pool of professional soldiers available to Byzantine generals at the time. Saif al-Dawla, already in the vicinity of Hadath before the Byzantines arrived, likely secured the higher ground. We know little about the ratio of infantry to cavalry in either force, except that Mutanabi explicitly mentions the Byzantine cataphractoi. What all the Muslim sources emphasize, however, is the decisive charge led by Saif with a personal retinue of 500 Ghulam horsemen, apparently aimed at the center of the Byzantine line, where Phocas's banner was visible. In accordance with the military treatises, the commander would normally take position in the second line, behind the cataphractoi. It is therefore plausible that Saif directed his assault at precisely this critical point. The reported Byzantine casualties, around 3,000, both infantry and cavalry, suggest that after the cavalry line was broken, the surviving units may have tried to regroup into infantry squares, only to be overwhelmed by Saif's attack. The next great clash came outside Tarsus in 965, during the campaign led by Nicephorus Phocas. Leo the Deacon, our chief source, does not offer a detailed narrative of battlefield maneuvers, but does describe the emperor's preparation. Determined to maximize the advantage of his heavy cavalry, Phocas ordered the surrounding fields cleared of vegetation that might hinder movement or conceal ambushes. The imperial army was deployed with the ironclad horsemen in the front line, archers and slingers behind them, Phocas himself commanding the right wing with a large squadron of regular cavalry, and John Tzimiskes leading the left. This formation reflects the principles laid down in the manuals: cataphractoi in the center, regular cavalry on the flanks, and missile troops behind to cover the advance. Although the infantry are not mentioned, they likely followed in support. The chronicler's description of the Byzantine advance emphasizes discipline and training. He depicts the cavalry divisions moving forward with flawless precision, the plain glittering with the gleam of armor. This spectacle alone seems to have broken enemy morale, as the defenders of Tarsus quickly fled in panic. Yet, despite the vivid description, no additional information survives about the detailed tactics of the day. A few years later, the confrontation at Alexandretta in 971 brought Byzantium face-to-face with the Fatimids. This clash followed the imperial capture of Antioch and coincided with the Fatimid seizure of Egypt and Syria, making northern Syria a natural battlefield between two rising powers. The Fatimid governor, Jafar ibn Fallah, assembled a major expedition to retake Antioch, only to suffer a decisive defeat at the hands of Byzantine forces led by the Duke of Mesopotamia. Late Muslim chroniclers provide most of what we know about this battle. They describe the engagement as a rout that secured Antioch and the surrounding region for the Byzantines, though they offer no tactical details. Skylitzes gives the improbable figure of 100,000 for the Fatimid army, but his report on its composition is valuable. It included Egyptians, Persians, Berbers, Daylamites, Yemenis, and Ethiopians, reflecting the diverse imperial reach of the Fatimid state. According to the Yemeni writer Idris ibn al-Hassan, who was active in the 15th century, the Fatimid commander Futuh led an army of around 20,000 men, far more believable than the 100,000 claimed by Skylitzes. After securing control of the area surrounding Antioch, this force eventually withdrew once Byzantine reinforcements arrived, though the source does not clarify why such a large army would retreat so quickly without stronger resistance. Another account, by the Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, explains that Futuh had detached a corps of about 4,000 soldiers to occupy Alexandretta, a vital port that supplied Antioch through its caravan traffic. This detachment was defeated by the Byzantine garrison. A more detailed explanation comes from Abu Bakr ibn al-Dawadari, writing in the 14th century, who also mentions the 4,000-strong force, but adds a vivid description of the stratagem that sealed its fate. As the Fatimids advanced on the Byzantine camp, they discovered the tents and immediately fell to plundering. The Byzantine commander, the Turbazi, having anticipated their move, had already pulled back with his troops into nearby high ground. At the moment the Fatimids dispersed, intent on loot, the Byzantines launched their attack from all sides, cutting them down. This victory was pivotal, not only lifting the pressure on Antioch, but also ensuring Byzantine dominance in northern Syria for nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, in Thrace, Bardas Skleros was sent with an army of roughly 12,000 men, mostly Eastern troops according to Skylitzes, to confront the Rus's host, devastating the region. Skylitzes claims the invaders numbered 308,000, a clear exaggeration, though there is little doubt they significantly outnumbered the Byzantines. Recognizing this imbalance, Bardas avoided a direct pitched battle and instead relied on guile and careful planning, hoping to use deception and tactical finesse to overcome the numerical disadvantage. His first step was to gather intelligence on the enemy's strength, composition, and morale. For this task, he dispatched the patrician John Allocassius with a small detachment to reconnoiter the Rus, an operation in line with standard practice whereby scouts, known as procursatores, were used to collect such crucial information. The decisive move came when Skleros arranged an ambush near Arcadiopolis. Allocassius was instructed to engage the enemy briefly and then stage a retreat, but to do so in an orderly fashion without breaking formation, retreating slowly enough to entice pursuit. Once the Patzinaks, fighting alongside the Rus, had been lured deep into the chosen ground, hidden Byzantine troops struck from both flanks. This maneuver mirrors the instructions in the 10th century treatise on skirmishing, which recommended feigned flight and ambush as a means of destroying numerically superior foes. The first detachment of Patzinaks was annihilated, and though the larger Rus's army soon attacked, it too was eventually broken after close combat in the confined terrain. The victory was completed when regular cavalry, not the cataphractoi, pursued the fleeing enemy, as advised by military manuals. The triumph at Arcadiopolis provided Emperor John Tzimiskes with invaluable insights into the Rus, their fighting style, and their weaknesses. He put this knowledge to use the following year, when he launched his Bulgarian campaign that culminated in the siege of Doristolon. Leading around 30,000 men, the emperor marched through undefended mountain passes, exploiting the fact that the Russes were preoccupied with suppressing a Bulgar revolt. The army avoided the kind of disasters that had befallen Byzantine forces in earlier centuries when attempting to cross similar terrain. Leo the Deacon explicitly compared Tzimiskes' cautious movements with the fatal mistakes of Emperor Nicephorus V at Pliska in 811, when wooden palisades erected in the passes had trapped and destroyed the imperial army. The Byzantines had learned well from such past disasters. At Doristolon, the Byzantine army deployed directly in front of the city gates. Leo the Deacon describes the formation in detail. The infantry held the center, flanked by cataphractoi positioned on both wings. Archers and slingers were placed immediately behind the infantry, tasked with providing covering fire as long as the enemy remained within range. To strengthen his flanks further, Tzimiskes held back 2 additional units of cataphractoi in reserve. Since the Russes lacked cavalry and had little experience with mounted warfare, it is likely that the emperor intended to break their formation by concentrating his attacks on the wings, where they were most exposed. This tactical arrangement demonstrates both the adherence to established military doctrine and Tzimiskes' ability to adapt to the particular vulnerabilities of his foe. What we can reconstruct about the first clash at Doristolon is that the Rus opened the fight with their characteristic ferocity, but the Byzantines held firm. After managing to break through the enemy line in a few places, the Russes were forced to retreat and reform their shield wall. The sources are not clear about which Byzantine units took part in this opening struggle, which dragged on until evening, when the infantry and cavalry of the empire failed to break the dense Rus's formation. Emperor Tzimiskes committed his reserve heavy cavalry on the wings in a last counterattack meant to shatter the enemy's morale. At that moment, the trumpeters gave the signal, and the imperial troops surged forward in unison. Pressed hard, The Russes retreated behind the safety of Dorostalon's walls, making it obvious that the Byzantines would have to prepare for a prolonged siege. The next two encounters outside the city are poorly recorded, but the fourth engagement is somewhat clearer. After the Rus had succeeded in damaging a Byzantine siege engine with a sortie, Sviatoslav sought to build on his men's rising confidence by leading them out into battle. The Byzantines formed a deep phalanx, almost certainly using the same deployment as in the first clash: infantry in the center, cataphractoi guarding the flanks, and reserve cavalry with archers and slingers positioned behind them. On 24th July, Sviatoslav again marched out, this time deliberately choosing ground closer to the city walls, where the battlefield narrowed. Skylitz's comments that the cramped terrain hindered the Byzantines, depriving them of the space needed to fight to their full potential. He observed that woodland on one side and marshland on the other gave the Rus a tactical advantage, since the imperial cavalry could not easily maneuver. Leo the Deacon reports that the emperor himself led the Byzantines out of camp, likely maintaining the threefold division with cataphractoi once more anchoring both wings. The Russes opened the battle by striking the center, while their javelin throwers inflicted heavy losses and disorder among the imperial horsemen, making it difficult for them to attempt an encirclement. The heat of midsummer compounded the soldiers' suffering, and so Tzimiskes ordered waterskins to be distributed to the troops and their mounts, allowing them to continue the fight. This detail matches the advice of contemporary manuals, which assigned archers and slingers within the infantry formations the task of protecting such logistical operations. The turning point came when Bardas Phocas, realizing that his cavalry could not operate effectively in such a narrow space, ordered a staged withdrawal toward the plain. His commanders were told to give the impression of retreating without breaking rank, drawing the enemy further away from the city before suddenly turning back to charge. This deception worked flawlessly. The Russes pursued in the belief that the Byzantines were in flight, only to be caught in the open. Leo the Deacon presents this as a genuine retreat, perhaps reflecting either his limited understanding of military tactics or the seamless way in which the maneuver was executed, while Skylitzes, writing later but with considerable military knowledge, recognized it as a deliberate stratagem. The decisive moment followed when Tzimiskes released his elite cataphract cavalry from reserve. According to Skylitzes, several senior officers spearheaded the attack, while Leo emphasizes that the emperor himself led the charge alongside his guard to inspire his men. With the heavy cavalry striking the flanks, the infantry pressing forward in the center, and another mounted contingent under Bardas Skleros striking from one side, the Rus were enveloped and forced back into Dorostalon. This use of encirclement in combination with a frontal push reflects exactly the kind of tactical patterns recommended in the military treatises of the age. 4 years after the Byzantine success over a Fatimid detachment at Alexandretta, Emperor John I, Tzimiskes advanced into Syria, capturing Apamea on the Orontes before pushing into the south. While Basil II's long Bulgarian wars would later dominate the empire's military attention, the battles of the Orontes in 994 and Apamea in 998 marked the high point of the struggle between Byzantium and the Fatimids for control of Syria. The sources for the Orontes campaign are scant. Yahya, writing in Syriac, records only that Basil II instructed Michael Bortzes, the Duke of Antioch, to march against the Fatimid general Manjutakin, a Turk by origin. Another Syriac chronicler, Bar Hebraeus, writing in the 13th century, estimates the Byzantine army at roughly 50,000 men, composed of both cavalry and infantry. It is certain that Armenian contingents played a major role given their resettlement across the region in previous decades. The Fatimid army may have numbered around 30,000, and although the exact composition is uncertain, it likely included Turkish cavalry, elite Iranian infantry from Daylem, former Ikshidid and Kafurid units, and Bedouin tribes from Syria and North Africa. According to al-Makrizi, Manjutakin set out from Damascus in the spring of 994, devastating the countryside around Antioch before marching east toward Aleppo. In response, Bortzes joined forces with Hamdanid troops under Lulu al-Kabir, guardian of the young Emir Sa'id al-Dawla. As news of their approach reached him, Manjutakin lifted his siege of Aleppo and moved west to meet them, the two armies encamping along the Orontes. The details of the ensuing battle remain obscure. The Byzantine and Hamdanid troops held the western ford of the river, but Bortzes hesitated to force a crossing. Manjutakin took the initiative, sending Bedouins and part of his Turkish or Daylami units to probe the Hamdanid positions. Panic soon spread through the Hamdanid camp, which was overrun and plundered. The Byzantines, seeing their allies collapse, abandoned the field as well, leaving thousands dead along with their commanders and supply train. The defeat was severe, marking a major setback for Byzantine influence in northern Syria. Several questions remain unresolved concerning the battle at the Orontes. One is whether the Byzantine commanders had enough time to arrange their troops into the double-layered hollow square recommended for river crossings. Since the sources note that sentries were guarding the ford, it seems improbable that the army would have been caught entirely off guard. Yahya even portrays Bortzes as a highly cautious commander, consistent with the long-standing military advice that river crossings should always be approached with strict discipline, particularly when the enemy holds the opposite bank. Another issue is whether the Byzantines camped in the same order as their intended battle formation, as the Praecepta Militaria of Nicephorus Phocas advises, so that troops could be ready to fight immediately in the event of a surprise attack. The accounts are unfortunately vague. Both Al-Qalanisi and Bar Hebraeus describe how an elite corps of Egyptian infantry broke through the Byzantine lines and secured victory for Manjutakin. This contingent was almost certainly composed of Daylami foot soldiers, famous for their skill with battle axes, spears, short swords, bows, and shields, and for their ability to fight in close, disciplined ranks. What we lack is any detail about how the Byzantine leaders reacted to this attack. Did the Armenians form up in a deep phalanx to resist the Daylamis and Turkish cavalry? Were the heavy cavalry units given enough space to maneuver effectively? Was the Daylami charge preceded by a coordinated strike from Turkish mounted troops and archers? These are all possibilities, but the narratives leave them unanswered. A few years later, at almost the same location, another disaster struck the imperial forces. Damianos Dalasinos, who had replaced Michael Bortzes in 995, tried to exploit turmoil within the Fatimid Caliphate by marching against Apamea, a base of strategic importance for campaigns against Aleppo. In early summer 998, the Fatimid general Jaish ibn al-Samsama advanced east with reinforcements and naval support to relieve the city. The armies again faced each other across the Orontes. Ibn al-Qalanisi describes the battlefield as a broad meadow beneath the hill of Qalat al-Mudik, bordered by the lake of Apamea on one side and the river on the other, a setting that would have restricted cavalry movement and made enveloping maneuvers difficult. Numbers for the Byzantine force are not given, but the 6,000 dead reported after the fighting suggest it was sizable. Callinicci records 10,000 Fatimid troops, including around 1,000 Bedouin horsemen, a contingent of Daylami infantry who bore the brunt of the Byzantine assault, and 500 Gulam cavalry under Bishara the Ikshidite. Dalasinos seized the initiative by ordering his men across the Orontes, directing the main thrust against the Daylamis in the center. The imperial attack initially succeeded. The Fatimid wings collapsed, thousands were cut down, and only the Gulam cavalry held their ground. The turning point came when Dalasinos, accompanied only by a small guard of 10 Gulams and his sons, exposed himself too boldly. A Kurdish Gulam, spotting his banner, charged and struck the Duke fatally. The loss of the commander shattered Byzantine morale, and the battle ended in disaster. The sources again leave important gaps. We do not know how the Byzantine and Fatimid forces deployed, whether al-Samsama's position on the right flank indicated higher ground, or whether he placed his Daylami infantry in the center to absorb the main assault. Nor do we know how the Byzantines crossed the river. Manuals of the time prescribed that the elite Tagmata units should cross first, in strict order, but tacticians always warned against such a maneuver under enemy pressure. It is possible that the Armenians or another infantry detachment went first to secure a bridgehead before the cavalry attempted the crossing. Historical parallels, such as the difficulties faced by the English at Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn, remind us how dangerous such river crossings could be when the opposite bank was contested. Even if the Byzantines managed to cross in good order, other questions arise. Was the ground suitable for them to form their typical hollow square formation? Which units actually managed to break the Daylami line? And who took part in pursuing the fleeing Fatimid forces? Byzantine tactical manuals advised against unleashing the cataphractoi in pursuit, instead assigning that role to regular cavalry units following behind. Yet Callinicci suggests Dalasinos remained near his standard, apparently supervising the gathering of booty rather than controlling an organized pursuit. This raises the possibility that discipline gave way to plundering, a stark contrast to the carefully structured recommendations of the strategists. Once again, the evidence raises more questions than it answers, leaving modern historians with little certainty about how the battle actually unfolded.